Well, hi again, Mr. Bleeker here. Thanks for coming back. We're moving into Chapter 17, the nervous system. It's a very large topic which I've broken into 5 major areas. In the first lesson, we look at nervous tissue, so types of nerves, and how our reflexes work. Lesson 2, we look at the chemical nature of a nerve impulse, so how our biological wiring works. In Lesson 3, we look at something called synapses, and that's a little gap between our biological wiring and how signals can jump from one nerve to another. It's a chemical process and it's quite interesting, so we'll get into detail there. Lesson 4, organization of the nervous system. So we'll look at the central nervous system and we'll look quite in depth at the peripheral as well. Lesson 5, parts of the brain. Good look at the limbic system there. We got a lot to do, so let's get going with lesson number 1. All right, here we go. Let's go full screen, fewer distractions. There we go. So as far as the nervous system goes, we have 2 major areas. The first we refer to as the central nervous system, or CNS, and that is our brain and spinal column. So we make a lot of our judgments, of course, conscious judgments, unconscious judgments as well, via the brain. The spinal cord is the major relay center to nerves that are going to go off through the body. It's also going to be a major relay center for information coming back from the body. Hot, cold, things like that the central nervous system needs to be aware of and be able to respond to. Your peripheral nervous system, which is figured in the next slide here, PNS, is, you can think of it as all the little nerves that, there we go, all the nerves that radiate from your central nervous system and out towards the edges. Let's take a look at that now. Now, if you see those fine sort of root-like structures right here, all of this, and I'll just encircle it. Everything here is your peripheral nervous system, so I'll just disinclude your brain and spinal column. Now, all the types of nerves, everything from pressure sensitivity to your sensation of pain, your sensation of heat, that's your peripheral nervous system. And it's connected to all of our sensors so that our central nervous system is aware of what's going on. Now, the central nervous system itself isn't just the brain. If you go just below the brain, we'll talk about this in more detail later, but for now, some important hardware here. Your cerebellum is responsible for coordinated motor activity. So when you walk, smooth sort of motions, that's a function of your cerebellum. Sometimes people get confused between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. And the cerebrum is your brain proper, whereas the cerebellum, you can feel if you just go to the base of your skull, right about there, squishy tissue, you can feel that right about there. And when you come down from the cerebellum, right here, this region, which I'm just going to fill in for you, is, and I'm filling in too much of it, but making a point, is your medulla oblongata. And that's a very important center for breathing and respiration and things like that. So from your central nervous system, you have major nerves that radiate off like this. If you've ever had back pain, any impingement on these nerves can drive you absolutely crazy. For example, if you impinge on the sciatic nerve, you can get something called sciatica. And that pain travels down your leg and skips your knee and sometimes goes all the way to your heel. So chiropractic care looks at keeping pressure off of these nerves, for example. Now, as far as nerve tissue goes, there's 3 basic types you need to know about. The first are the sensory nerves. So when you feel pain or when you feel something that's hot, these sensory nerves are in your periphery or in your out towards your edges, right? Periphery is just a synonym for that. And they carry information back to your CNS. So let's highlight one term here. I think that's quite important. And that's it carries information towards the CNS. There we go. I wanted to highlight it. There we go. Now, once that information comes to your central nervous system, for example, if you put your hand on a hot stove, then you would want to produce a response. So when you send signals from the central nervous system, let's just highlight that. There we go. Those signals will either go out to a muscle to pull your hand away from a hot stove, or they could go to a gland. So when you smell delicious food, right, and the salivary glands begin to fire, it just happens to us all, then that's as a result of a motor nerve telling a gland to do something. Now, when we talk about a response is an effect. So motor nerves are called effectors. So you sense and then you do something about it down here. Okay. So there must be some sort of in between because information is going to come into the central nervous system and then you have to have a different nerve. For example, a motor nerve, something has to happen. Well, what's the nerve that switches between sensation and effect? Well, that's one that we call a motor nerve. I think I'll switch my color. There we go. So between a sensory and a motor nerve, we have an in-betweener, and it's called an interneuron. Let's take a look at this now. Let's look at all types. If you sort of zoom in here, sensory neuron, you can have little, let's say for example, you're sensing pain. So we'll draw a little lightning bolt, a little zap, for example. And that information will travel down the specialized cell called sensory neuron. It actually travels down many, but we're just keeping it simple here. And then there has to be sort of a receipt of that signal. So that signal will come in from a sensory neuron, and then that signal has to be relayed like this to a motor neuron because you want to produce an effect. Pull your hand away from a stove. We'll look at that in just a moment. But what in the world, let's draw a slightly different color. What in the world does the relaying? Well, this, I'm just highlighting it with a bit of red so you can see it here. This is what we know is called an interneuron. Now, if you notice sort of this brown area I'm working in up here, it's interesting. It sort of looks like a cross-section of spinal tissue has this sort of butterfly-looking material here. And what you have right there is it's composed of what we call interneurons. It's a little switching area. Now, because it's darker, we call this dark matter, and we call this light matter. So what's the difference really? What it really means is sensory neurons and motor neurons, they're insulated. So their wiring, I'll just draw it off to the side here. Their wiring is got a little bit of insulation around the outside of it, like this. Right? However, I'll just go back to the red color. Interneurons, they have no such wiring. They're just like bare wire. Ooh, I guess I don't need to turn off my device, do I? There we go. So they are uninsulated wires, and they'll appear darker. And when you look at a cross section of spinal tissue, it's okay for them to be uninsulated because they're very short wiring. In fact, that's the whole reason for that. Let's take a peek at some of our neurons that are insulated. They have a little bit of fatty tissue around the outside, so they're represented by sort of that yellowy color in our spinal tissue, the sensory and motor neurons. Now, the reason why sensory and motor neurons have a little bit of wiring is because they need to carry signals a very long distance. Think about it this way. If you were in the school and you took a very long wire and you plugged it into your iPod, if you plugged that wire in, and let's say you had a 300-foot long cable and you ran it out to some little speakers and you pressed play, you would probably get virtually no sound. You'd be lucky to get any sound at all. Reason for that is a physics concept. There's a little bit of resistance in a wire. So what we want to do is try to do a little bit of specialized insulating so that we reduce the resistance in the biological wiring. Now, if you're a sensory neuron, you have to send signals a long distance. You're going to use a little bit of insulation. Motor neurons, well, think about a giraffe. Information has to lead all the way from the brain, and it lead out to, think about how far it is down to, for example, the foot. That's a tremendously long distance. We don't want the signal to be lost, so we'll use insulated wiring. But this wiring in the middle, from here to here, in an interneuron, well, this is just such a short distance that you don't need, let's see if I can get that. Learning to use my new stylus. I think I'll erase. Driving me crazy. You don't need as much insulation. In fact, you don't need any at all. So there we go. That's your interneuron. I'll just move on. My stylus is really driving me crazy today. So I'm just going to leave airplay for a second, and I want to talk about the anatomy of a neuron, a nerve cell. And you are seeing the better parts of it here, but got a few animations to show you. There we go. So this word here, dendrite, is a word that means tree. So if you think about in winter particularly, the branches sticking up, it's the dendrite where the signal begins, and the signal is sort of carried down through this cable we call the axon until it reaches the end of the axon at something called the axon terminals. Zoom in on this a little bit. Here's another shot of it with the dendrites. And here's that insulation I was telling you about. Now, specialized cells called Schwann cells basically make a sausage-like wrap of their membranes. And this is membranes themselves are phospholipids. So yes, they're lipids. And that is a very good insulating material. And you'll notice they're sausage-like links. It doesn't cover the whole axon. It just covers part of it. Now, this is one cell. So when you look at a sensory neuron, it's kind of interesting. I've always said it looks a little bit like an octopus, right? Where here's sort of the octopus, and here's an arm, and here's an arm like this. It is still a cell with a full, there's the nucleus there, there's the cell body, right? Staying alive, doing biological processes as you would expect. A sensory neuron, of course, is going to receive sort of a signal from the dendrites, and the signal goes in this direction, and as it comes along here, it's going down something called the axon, which is like a sort of a long sort of shaft, and that carries through down here to the end of the axon, and these are little axon terminal bulbs. Almost look like little suction cups, don't they? And little chemicals will come out of here at these little regions right here. It's tiny, you can't see. It's called a synapse, and the signal will activate the dendrites of this interneuron. And when this interneuron fires, it'll start a signal that will go down past its cell body, down its axon, and it will activate the dendrites of a motor neuron. So if you've felt pain, right, put your hand on a hot stove, signal goes through an interneuron. Now remember where interneurons are, right? This is in your central nervous system. Specifically, that's in your spine. Okay, so you're relaying through the spine here. And then the signal is passed on from these axonal tips here to the dendrites of this cell body, and the signal goes down the axon until you get to an effector, like a muscle that pulls your hand away. You know what? We should look at that now. I think it's time. So I wanted to show it to you right here. I'll just reset this. So, if you've ever burned yourself or cut yourself, you notice you don't think about it. You pull your hand back almost instantly. You still feel pain. So let's look at our labels here so we're aware of what we're talking about here. The red signal, danger, I guess in this case, is going to be our sensory neuron. Our interneuron, for purposes here, our relay is green, and our motor neuron is going to do something about it. So here's an effector here, specifically a muscle. So this is what is called a reflex arc. So if you burn yourself, the sensory neuron, there we go, the sensory neuron realizes that something's happened and it fires. So step one, there's a stimulus. The pain receptor is stimulated. These are dendrites, by the way. And the signal goes along the sensory neuron. So it'll get here. Okay, so we've gone down a very long axon. Now the relayer here, the interneuron, when it fires, it doesn't just send a signal to the effector. You're also made aware of it. So this is where you're feeling pain. But you'll notice by the time you feel the pain, you've already done something about it. This is very smart evolution. You need to be able to respond to these situations pretty quickly. So a signal is sent to a motor neuron to the effector, and you automatically pull up your hand. So if we look at this again in totality, we can see what we have is they call this a reflex arc. It's a reflex where automatically there's a response. If you go into the doctor's office and he taps on your knee or she taps on your knee, they just tap on the tendon just below and that gets your muscle to automatically fire. Well, if you've ever walked down a series of stairs and you're talking to a friend or something, not paying attention, and you think you're at the bottom, right? You think there's one more step and you misjudge, and instead of falling, your basically your leg will realize, oh, there's one more step. Or if you miss a step, that's the worst. If there's one more step to take, I do that all the time. And I think about the bottom. It's like, oops. And it's twice as far as I believed. What'll happen is your quadriceps, of course, will flex really hard to hold you up because you're trying not to fall down. The problem is it flexes so hard, it's just, you have little stretch receptors in your knee, and when you miss that last step, your quads fire automatically. Problem is your quads can fire too hard, and your ligaments and tendons may not be ready for the pressure they're under, so you can pull a muscle or you can tear something. It's another reflex arc, but it's kind of in our interest not to fall down. So these reflex arcs are important, and yes, they're on the test, and you need to know them. This one was really neat. Children's Hospital of Boston has just a great analysis of looking at a nerve cell. So I'll put this on the site. Um, Everything from the nuclei to the soma. This is what the cell body of a nerve cell is called. Soma. There's the dendrites out there, which means branching, right? This receives a signal. And highlighting over this, there's your axon or axon. And that is the myelin sheath right there. And it's a little bit of insulation that goes along the wire. We sort of a spoiler alert here. The reason this is really important is it helps the signal to jump down the axon. And if the signal sort of jumps down the axon, if it doesn't have to plow its way through the axon, that signal will be much more likely to reach the end and not degrade. In conditions, there are conditions where these can be nibbled away, an autoimmune disease. Multiple sclerosis targets this material here, so these little insulators, and it makes it harder for the signal to get down the axon, and that leads to all sorts of complications where muscles don't work, problems with vision, etc. Now we get down here to the tips, and we're at what's called we're at the end of the axon, and there are the synaptic bulbs. And as you jump the cleft right there, that cleft is called your synapse until you reach your next dendrite. So some pretty neat animations here. I'll have to remember to turn that sound off. But what you've got, I'll turn it off for now. What you've got is a little voltage over time over here. So a little graph, and you can see that as the signal passes down, you can see this little blip. And I promise that little blip we'll be coming back to this later. Just set the stage for this. Anyways, great animation. Big shout out here to Children's Hospital Boston. Let's see. Just wanted to show you an interneuron, and you notice it really is just all dendrite, right, and all axons and these little synaptic bulbs synaptic bulbs here, and it doesn't have any wiring because it's tiny, and you find it in the central nervous system. So its job is relatively straightforward, to act as a relay. So I'll get back to the notes here. Once I just turn on AirPlay, and we'll be good to go. There we are. So there's our tour. This is a graph, for example, that you would want to know completely. Okay, make sure that you know it fully, because that's a typical test question as to what these parts are and what they do. Now we get into a little bit more sort of what I think a little more meat on the bones here, and we look at these regions along here, and what we've got for color here. Turn my pen back on. There we go. And there's little bits of insulation down the axon, and it's wrapped around. It's literally, we'll look at it. If you saw a side profile, it's a little bit of cell membrane tissue that's wrapped around this thing, kind of like a sausage roll. So this wrapping that I've sort of indicated here with red, it's known as the myelin sheath. It's a sheath that goes around the axon. Now that sheath is laid down by something called a Schwann cell. And the function of the Schwann cell is to extend layers and layers of its cell membrane around the wiring, so to speak, and provide insulation. And that's good because now the signal, one thing you know about electrical impulses, they don't travel so well through insulators. So instead of traveling through an insulator, a way to think of it is the signal doing these little jumps. Now, I remember my daughter's watching Dora the Explorer, and the word for jump, a Spanish word for jump, is called is salta. So we call these saltatory conductive jumps, or saltatory jumps, saltatory conduction down the nerve. And the reason why this is important is the signal makes its way down the nerve to the axonal terminals, and it doesn't degrade. Now I'll explain why that's important. If you've ever had very long speaker wire, the disadvantage of really long wiring, if you try to push the signal all the way through the wire, is you encounter resistance and you lose some of the signal to heat. The signal degrades. So extremely long speaker wire isn't a good idea unless you have an amplifier. So the way that we deal with that is our nerves are wrapped in these little bits of wiring, these little sheaths, and we have the signal just jump down parts of the wire. And this form of conduction makes sure that the signal doesn't degrade very much. There's more to it than that, but that's how we'll introduce the concept. Less resistance. So here's your myelin sheath and your axon, just for color purposes. Let's just label it here. There's your axon in the middle, and the Schwann cell is doing the wrapping here. Now, what happens if this is affected? You might have heard of immune disorders where this stuff gets nibbled and it starts to get worn down. And that becomes a problem because now the signal has a harder time getting down the axon. Well, there's some disorders, for example, like multiple sclerosis, where these Schwann cells are being affected. And without having their wrappings, the signals don't get to the end. So with multiple sclerosis, for example, vision can go, control over the muscles starts to degrade, and you can see how that could be fatal over time. Gotta love those Twitter notifications. It's very problematic over time, obviously, for survival because we need signals to get from our medulla oblongata to continue to autoregulate the heart, the lungs, and things like that. So myelin gives nerves this white appearance, which I talked about earlier, and that's called the white matter. And there's a little note there about multiple sclerosis, pardon me, and we think of it as an autoimmune disease. So if we can get um, our immune systems to leave myelinated white matter alone, then there shouldn't be so much of an issue. But we haven't figured this one out entirely. MS can go into remission where these attacks sort of stop, but we still have a lot more to learn about that. So long axons, and I refer to it as long speaker wire, well, we need the signal to make it, right? So they're highly myelinated, so long axons. Uh, it's important for them to be uh, taken care of. So we refer to them, a lot of the sensory neurons, motor neurons, we're talking about white matter. But the unmyelinated ones, we refer to those as gray matter. And really short little ones, the example of this would be your interneurons. So there is one last little thing to show you here, talking about talking about white matter versus dark matter, or myelinated versus unmyelinated nerves. I'll just show that here. This is a neat little animation that shows the propagation, which means the continuation of the nerve impulse. Now, if you notice right here, what this yellow represents is a Schwann cell. So the nerve impulse itself doesn't travel through this region here. Instead, you see these little jumps. Now, there's a little bit more going on inside here, but I want you to focus here. Essentially, it's jumping from node to node. So now I'll tell you these little unmyelinated regions right here are known as the nodes of Ranvier. And they're unmyelinated. And that's where the signal itself is doing its saltatory jumps. You can think of it this way. It's a simplified way of understanding it, but it's good initially. The signal can jump from this exposed wire to this area with this exposed wire. And that reduces the overall resistance so that the signal travels down the end. And that's what we call saltatory conduction, folks. Okay, that'll be the end of lesson 1. I'll try to keep it short and sweet. We'll look at the biochemistry of this signal next. Thanks again, folks. Ciao.